When bullets fly through a storm-torn night and a mother's desperate cry pierces the darkness, sometimes salvation comes from the most broken of men. This is the story of Abigail Turner, a woman who endured 100 beatings but never broke until she met the lonely cowboy who promised to be gentle. Welcome to tonight's tale, friends. Stay with me until the very end to see how love can bloom even in the bloodiest soil. And don't forget to comment what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels across our great nation. The thunder cracked like God's own whip across the Montana prairie, and Abigail Turner knew with bone-deep certainty that tonight death rode hard on her heels. Rain lashed her face as she pressed her sick daughter Charlotte closer to her chest, the child's fevered body burning through the thin cotton dress that was all they'd managed to grab before fleeing. Behind them, the rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats grew closer, punctuated by the occasional crack of lightning that illuminated the endless grasslands stretching toward the distant mountains. "Mama," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. I can't breathe right." Abigail's heart clenched as she felt the child's labored breathing against her shoulder. The infection had been growing worse for days, and without proper medicine, without a real doctor. She pushed the thought away. First, they had to survive the night. Everything else was a luxury they couldn't afford. "Shh, baby girl," she murmured, adjusting her grip on the reins of their exhausted mare. "Just hold on a little longer. We're almost—" The gunshot split the night like a thunderclap, and their horse screamed, stumbling forward before crashing to the muddy ground. Abigail managed to twist her body to shield Charlotte as they hit the earth hard, rolling through the wet grass and rocks. Pain exploded through her shoulder, but she kept her arms wrapped protectively around her daughter. Well, look what we got here." The voice cut through the rain like a rusty blade, and Abigail's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice. Silas Morgan, the bounty hunter who'd been tracking them for 3 weeks ever since they'd fled Denver with the evidence that could bring down Augustus Montgomery and his railroad empire. Slowly, Abigail raised her head, spitting mud from her mouth. Through the rain, she could make out 3 riders approaching, their shapes dark against the lightning-split skissy. The one in the center sat his horse with the casual confidence of a man who'd never met a situation he couldn't solve with violence. "Silas," she said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Still Augustus's lapdog, I see." The bounty hunter's laughter was like gravel in a tin cup. Now, Mrs. Turner, that ain't no way to talk to an old friend." He dismounted with fluid grace, his hand resting on the colt at his hip. "Especially when that friend's got a job to do." Abigail struggled to her feet, keeping Charlotte behind her. The child was too weak to run, too sick to hide. If this was their end, at least she could make sure it was quick for her daughter. "The papers ain't here, Silas," she lied smoothly. "Hidden them somewhere safe. Kill us, and you'll never find what Augustus wants." "Oh, I reckon I will." Silas's smile was all teeth and malice. "See, Mrs. Turner, I got all the time in the world to search. But first," he drew his pistol with practiced ease, "first, I'm going to make sure you and that sickly little girl of yours don't cause me no more trouble." The other 2 riders had spread out, flanking them. Professional killers, Abigail realized. This wasn't just about the papers anymore. Augustus wanted to make sure no one ever learned what Judge Turner had discovered about the railroad's illegal land grabs and the mysterious deaths of the families who'd refused to sell. "Mama," Charlotte whispered, tugging weakly at her mother's skirt. "I'm scared." Abigail knelt down, cupping her daughter's burning face in her hands. The child's eyes were bright with fever, but also with trust. Absolute, unwavering faith that her mother would somehow make everything right. "Listen to me, Charlotte," Abigail said softly, aware that Silas was enjoying this moment, savoring their fear. "If something happens to Mama, I want you to run. Run as fast as you can toward those rocks over there, and don't look back. Promise me." "But Mama..." "Promise me, baby girl." Charlotte nodded, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "I promise." Abigail stood slowly, turning to face Silas with her chin raised. She'd been beaten 100 times in her 26 years by her father, when she was young by her first husband, before tuberculosis took him by life itself when it seemed determined to crush every dream she'd ever dared to hold. But she'd never broken, not once. "You want to kill us, you coward?" she said, her voice carrying across the storm. "Then do it, but know that every decent person in this territory will hunt you down for murdering a sick child." Silas's smile faltered slightly. "Decent people don't concern me none, Mrs. Turner, and after tonight won't nobody be looking for you anyway. Far as the world knows, you and your girl just disappeared." He raised the gun, aiming directly at Charlotte. That's when the first shot rang out. The bullet took Silas's hat clean off his head, spinning it into the darkness. All four of them, Abigail, Charlotte, and Silas's two men, froze as the echo rolled across the prairie. "Well now," came a new voice from somewhere in the darkness beyond their circle of lantern light. "Looks like we got ourselves a situation here." Silas spun toward the sound, his pistol searching for a target. "Who's there? Show yourself." "Oh, I'll show myself all right." The voice was calm, almost conversational, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas or maybe Arkansas. "But first, how about you and your boys put them guns down real gentle, like hate to see anyone get hurt on a night like this." "Like hell," one of Silas's men snarled, swinging his rifle toward the darkness. "Whoever you are, you just made the last mistake of your—" The second shot cut off his words permanently. The man toppled from his saddle, his rifle clattering to the ground beside him. Somewhere in the darkness, a horse whinnied softly. "Now that was just plain rude," the voice continued as if commenting on the weather. "Man tries to have a civilized conversation and you go waving guns around. Your mama never teach you no manners." Silas and his remaining man had taken cover behind their horses, trying to locate the shooter. "You got no idea who you're messing with, stranger," Silas shouted into the storm. "I'm working for Augustus Montgomery. That name mean anything to you?" A low chuckle drifted across the prairie. "Oh, it means something all right. Means you're about as popular as a rattlesnake in a prayer meeting." Abigail used the distraction to pull Charlotte toward the cluster of rocks she'd pointed out earlier. They made it halfway before Silas noticed. "Hold it right there." He swung his gun toward them. "I don't know who you are out there, but these women are my business. You ride on and maybe I'll let you live." "See, now that's where we got a problem," the stranger replied, "because I was raised to believe that a man who points a gun at a woman and child ain't much of a man at all, more like something you'd scrape off your boot." The third shot came so fast that Silas barely had time to dive aside. The bullet shattered the lantern hanging from his saddle, plunging them into near-total darkness. Only the sporadic lightning provided any illumination now. "Run!" Abigail hissed to Charlotte, half carrying the weakened child toward the rocks. They'd made it perhaps 20 yards when she heard the soft thud of boots hitting the ground behind them. Not Silas. This tread was different, steadier, more controlled. "Ma'am," the stranger's voice said quietly, much closer now. "Ma'am, you and your little girl need to get down low. This ain't over yet." Abigail turned, squinting through the rain and darkness. Lightning flickered, and for just a moment she saw him clearly, a tall man in a long coat, water streaming from the brim of his hat. His face was hidden in shadow, but she could see the rifle in his hands and the easy way he held it like it was part of him. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Name's Caleb Winters," he replied, never taking his eyes off the area where Silas and his remaining man had taken cover. "And right now, I'm the only friend you got." Another muzzle flash lit up the night as Silas's remaining gunmen tried to flank them. Caleb's return shot was immediate and precise. The man's scream cut through the storm, followed by the sound of a body hitting the muddy ground. "That leaves just you and me, Silas," Caleb called out conversationally, "and I'm betting you're smart enough to know how this ends." "You don't know what you're dealing with." Silas's voice cracked slightly. "Montgomery's got men everywhere. You kill me, he'll send a dozen more." "Maybe so," Caleb replied, "but that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight it's just you and me and this storm, and I'm thinking the storm's got better manners than you do." Abigail pressed Charlotte close, feeling the child's labored breathing against her neck. The fever was getting worse. Even if they survived this, Charlotte needed medicine, needed a doctor. But first, a shadow moved through the darkness to their left, Silas trying to circle around behind them. Abigail started to call out a warning, but Caleb was already moving fluid as water in the darkness. The two men met somewhere in the night, and for a moment all she could hear was the sound of a struggle, grunts, the thud of flesh hitting flesh, the metallic ring of a knife being drawn. Then silence. "Caleb," she called softly. "Still here, ma'am." His voice came from much closer than she'd expected. "Though I'm afraid Mr. Morgan ain't going to be bothering anyone anymore." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene. Silas lay motionless in the mud, his eyes staring sightlessly at the storm-torn sky. Caleb stood over him, breathing hard, a thin line of blood trickling from a cut on his cheek. "Is he—" Abigail couldn't finish the question. "Dead!" Caleb wiped the blood from his face with the back of his hand. "Yes, ma'am, sometimes that's the only language men like him understand." Charlotte stirred weakly in her arms. "Mama, are the bad men gone?" "They're gone, baby girl." Abigail whispered, tears of relief mixing with the rain on her face. "They're gone." Caleb approached them slowly, his rifle lowered but still ready. Up close, even in the dim light, Abigail could see that he was older than his voice had suggested, maybe 40, with lines around his eyes that spoke of hard years and harder choices. His clothes were worn but clean, and there was something about the way he moved that suggested military training. "Your daughter's sick," he observed, not making it a question. "Lung infection," Abigail admitted. "It's been getting worse. I was trying to get her to Denver to find a doctor, but—" She gestured helplessly at the carnage around them. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, studying Charlotte's flushed face and labored breathing. "Denver's 3 days' ride, even with good weather," he said finally. "She won't make it." The words hit Abigail like a physical blow. "There has to be something." "There is." Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. "My cabin's about 2 miles north of here. I got some medical supplies and—" He hesitated. "I used to be a doctor. Long time ago." Hope flared in Abigail's chest, so sudden and fierce it almost knocked her breathless. "You could help her." "I can try." Caleb looked up at the storm-lashed sky. "But we need to move now. This weather ain't going to get any better, and there might be more of Montgomery's men around." Abigail didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." Caleb whistled softly, and a moment later a magnificent black horse emerged from the darkness, followed by what Abigail first took to be another horse. It wasn't until the animal stepped into a patch of dim light that she realized it was a wolf or something very close to one. "That's Phantom," Caleb said, noticing her startled expression. "Found him as a pup, half dead from a trap. He's been with me ever since." The wolf dog regarded Abigail and Charlotte with intelligent yellow eyes, then moved to sniff at the bodies of the fallen men. Satisfied that they posed no threat, he padded back to Caleb's side. "Can you ride?" Caleb asked, checking the cinch on his saddle. "Yes, but Charlotte, she'll ride with me," he said firmly. "I can keep her steady, and she needs to stay as still as possible." Abigail wanted to protest, wanted to keep her daughter close, but she could see the logic in his words. And something about this strange, scarred man inspired trust. Perhaps it was the gentle way he'd spoken to Charlotte, or the fact that he'd risked his life to save 2 strangers. Caleb lifted Charlotte with surprising gentleness, settling her in front of him on the saddle. The child barely stirred, lost in fevered dreams. "What's her name?" he asked softly. "Charlotte. Charlotte Turner." "Well, Miss Charlotte," he murmured to the unconscious child. "You just hold on tight. We're going to get you somewhere warm and dry." Abigail mounted Silas's horse. The animal was better than their own dead mare, and the dead man certainly wouldn't be needing it. As they rode through the storm-torn night, she found herself studying her unlikely rescuer. Caleb Winters rode like a man born to the saddle, his body moving in perfect rhythm with his horse despite the burden of the sick child. The wolf dog loped alongside them, occasionally ranging ahead to scout the trail. There was something almost otherworldly about the scene, the lone rider, the wolf, the storm, as if they'd stepped out of an ancient legend. "Why did you help us?" Abigail called over the wind and rain. Caleb was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the storm. "Sometimes a man gets a chance to do the right thing," he said. "Doesn't happen often. When it does, you don't waste it." They rode in silence after that, focusing on the treacherous trail ahead. The storm seemed to be worsening, if that was possible, and more than once Abigail found herself gripping the saddle horn as her horse slipped on the muddy ground. Finally, after what felt like hours, she saw a dim light ahead. As they drew closer, she made out the shape of a small cabin nestled against a rocky outcropping. It was modest, but well built, with a stone chimney from which smoke rose despite the wind and rain. "Home sweet home," Caleb said with a hint of irony. "Ain't much, but it's dry." He dismounted carefully, keeping Charlotte stable in his arms. Phantom bounded ahead to the cabin door, scratching at it with one massive paw. "Easy, boy," Caleb murmured. We're almost there. The interior of the cabin was larger than Abigail had expected and surprisingly well appointed. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with bookshelves. There was a table, several chairs, and in one corner what looked like a medical examination table covered with a clean white sheet. Put her here, Caleb said, indicating the examination table. As Abigail gently laid Charlotte down, he lit several oil lamps filling the cabin with warm golden light. For the first time, Abigail got a clear look at the man who'd saved them. Caleb Winters was tall and lean, with dark hair shot through with silver at the temples. His face was weathered but handsome, with high cheekbones and deep-set gray eyes. There were scars on his hands and a longer one along his jaw, but they somehow added to rather than detracted from his appeal. What struck her most, though, was the expression in his eyes as he examined Charlotte. There was professional competence there, but also something deeper, a pain so profound it almost took her breath away. This was a man who'd lost something precious, she realized. Someone precious. How long has she had the fever? He asked, his hands gentle as he felt for Charlotte's pulse. 4 days, Abigail replied. Maybe 5. It started as just a cough, but then pneumonia, Caleb said grimly. Maybe worse. I need to listen to her lungs. He produced a stethoscope from a cabinet filled with medical supplies that wouldn't have looked out of place in a Denver hospital. As he examined Charlotte, his expression grew increasingly grave. It's bad, he said finally. The infection's deep and there's fluid building up. If we don't do something soon... He didn't finish the sentence, but Abigail understood. What can you do? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, studying Charlotte's flushed face. There's a procedure, he said finally. Risky, but it might save her life. I'd have to drain the fluid from her lungs, give her antibiotics I've got stored here. Then do it, Abigail said without hesitation. You don't understand. Caleb's gray eyes met hers, and she saw the doubt there, the fear. I haven't practiced medicine in 8 years. My hands... He held them up, and she could see the slight tremor in his fingers. I don't know if I can do this anymore. You can, Abigail said firmly. I don't know much about you, Caleb Winters, but I know you didn't save us just to let my daughter die in your cabin. You can do this. Something in her voice seemed to steady him. The tremor in his hands faded, and when he spoke again, his voice was stronger. All right then, he said, but I'll need your help, and I need to warn you this is going to be rough. On both of you. Abigail nodded, rolling up her sleeves. Tell me what to do. For the next several hours, as the storm raged outside, Abigail watched Caleb Winters transform before her eyes. Gone was the uncertain, haunted man who'd doubted his abilities. In his place stood a surgeon, precise, confident, completely focused on the task at hand. The procedure was every bit as harrowing as he'd warned. Charlotte woke during the initial stages, crying out for her mother, and Abigail had to hold her daughter's hand while Caleb worked with steady, sure movements to drain the infection from her lungs. Almost there, Miss Charlotte, he murmured as he worked. Just a little longer, and you're going to feel so much better. When it was over, Charlotte was breathing easier for the first time in days. The terrible rasping sound was gone, replaced by the deeper, steadier rhythm of healthy sleep. Caleb administered the antibiotics, then stepped back, exhaustion clear on his face. Now we wait, he said simply. Abigail sank into a chair beside the examination table, suddenly aware of how tired she was. The adrenaline that had carried her through the night was fading, leaving her feeling drained and shaky. Why? She asked softly. Why did you give up medicine? Caleb was cleaning his instruments, his movements methodical and precise. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then without looking up, he began to speak. I had a family once, he said quietly. Wife named Sarah, 2 little girls, Emma and Grace. We lived in San Francisco and I had a practice there. Good life, happy life. He set down the instrument he'd been cleaning and stared into the fire. There was a man named Augustus Montgomery who wanted to buy our land, wanted to run a railroad line right through our property. We refused. A lot of families in our area refused. Abigail's blood chilled. Montgomery. The same. Caleb's voice was flat, emotionless. One night our house caught fire. Sarah and the girls, they didn't make it out. I was at the hospital delivering a baby. By the time I got home, there was nothing left but ashes. I'm so sorry, Abigail whispered. Official cause was a faulty chimney, Caleb continued. But I knew better. Montgomery's men had been making threats getting more aggressive. After the fire, every family in the area suddenly decided to sell. Funny how that worked out. He finally looked at her and she saw the depth of his pain, the guilt that ate at him like acid. I couldn't prove anything. Couldn't save my family. Couldn't even save myself. So I ran. Came out here to hide from the world from my failures. Haven't touched a scalpel since. Until tonight, Abigail said softly. Until tonight. He glanced at Charlotte, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. Maybe some things are worth the risk. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm outside and the steady sound of Charlotte's breathing. Phantom had curled up near the fireplace, his yellow eyes watchful even in sleep. "Tell me about your husband," Caleb said eventually. "What did he find that made Montgomery so desperate to silence you?" Abigail took a deep breath. David was a federal judge, honest, principled, maybe too principled for his own good. About 6 months ago, he started investigating complaints about the railroad's land acquisition practices. What he found, she shook her head. Montgomery's people weren't just threatening families, they were murdering them, making it look like accidents or Indian raids. How many? Caleb's voice was barely a whisper. At least a dozen families that David could document, maybe more. He was preparing to present evidence to a federal grand jury when she wiped away a tear. They said it was a heart attack. David was only 32 years old and healthy as a horse. But you got the evidence. Some of it. David was careful. He hid copies of everything in different places. I managed to get one set before Montgomery's men came for me. Caleb stood up, pacing to the window. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to abate, though rain still lashed against the glass. "So Montgomery knows you have the papers, but not where they are." "That's right. And as long as I'm alive, there's a chance they'll surface someday. He can't afford that risk." "No," Caleb agreed grimly. "He can't." Charlotte stirred on the table, murmuring something in her sleep. Abigail was at her side, instantly smoothing the child's hair back from her fevered brow. The fever was breaking, she could feel it. "She's going to be all right," Caleb observed, checking her pulse again. "The antibiotics are working." "Thanks to you," Abigail said. "I don't know how to repay." "You don't owe me anything," Caleb interrupted. "Like I said, sometimes a man gets a chance to do the right thing." "But it was more than that, wasn't it?" Abigail studied his face in the firelight. "This was about your family too, about Montgomery." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe," he admitted finally. "Maybe it was time I stopped running." Outside, the wind was dying down, and the first faint hint of dawn was beginning to show on the horizon. Charlotte's breathing was steady and deep, now her fever almost completely broken. For the first time in weeks, Abigail allowed herself to hope that everything might actually be all right. That's when they heard the horses. Caleb was at the window, instantly peering through the glass. His face went pale. "How many men did you say Montgomery had?" he asked quietly. Abigail joined him at the window, her heart sinking as she saw the riders approaching through the pre-dawn gloom. At least a dozen men, all armed, all wearing the look of professional killers. "More than we can handle," she whispered. Caleb was already moving, gathering weapons from various hiding places around the cabin. He handed Abigail a rifle, checking to make sure it was loaded. "There's a root cellar behind the fireplace," he said tersely. "Take Charlotte and hide there. Whatever happens, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." "What about you?" Caleb's smile was grim as he checked his own rifle. "Me, I'm going to have a little conversation with Montgomery's boys, see if I can't convince them to find a new line of work." "Caleb, go," he said firmly. "Protect your daughter. Let me worry about the rest." The sound of horses was closer now, accompanied by rough voices and the jingle of spurs. Abigail scooped Charlotte up in her arms. The child was so much lighter than she should be, so fragile, and found the hidden entrance to the root cellar that Caleb had indicated. As she descended into the darkness below, holding her daughter close, she heard Caleb's voice calling out through the cabin door. "Well now," he said, his tone conversational, despite the circumstances. "This is private property, gentlemen. You boys lost or just looking for trouble?" The response was a gunshot that shattered the cabin's front window. Abigail closed her eyes and prayed for her daughter, for the broken man who'd saved them both. and for something she'd almost forgotten how to believe in the possibility that sometimes against all odds, the good guys actually won. Above her, the battle for their lives was about to begin. In the suffocating darkness of the root cellar, Abigail pressed Charlotte against her chest and listened to the symphony of violence erupting above their heads. Each gunshot made her flinch, each shout of rage or pain sent ice through her veins. Her daughter stirred weakly in her arms, the fever finally breaking, but leaving the child drained and vulnerable. "Mama," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "What's happening?" "Shh, baby girl," Abigail murmured, stroking her daughter's hair. "Just some men having a disagreement. It'll be over soon." But even as she spoke the comforting lie, Abigail knew the truth was far grimmer. The steady crack of rifle fire from multiple directions told her that Caleb was outnumbered at least 10-1. No matter how skilled he might be, no matter how determined, those weren't odds any man could overcome. Above them, she heard Caleb's voice ring out clear and strong. "That's close enough, boys. Next man takes another step gets to meet his maker." A rough laugh answered him. "You hear that, boys? This here hermit thinks he can take us all on. Augustus Montgomery sends his regards, Doc." Abigail's blood froze. They knew who Caleb was. This wasn't just about her and the papers anymore. Montgomery had discovered that the man who'd been hiding in these mountains was the same doctor whose family he'd murdered 8 years ago. "Tell Montgomery he can go straight to hell." Caleb's response was punctuated by another rifle shot followed by a scream of pain. "And tell him I'm coming for him next." "You ain't going nowhere, Winters," another voice shouted. "We got you surrounded. Come out peaceful-like and maybe we'll make it quick." The sound of splintering wood echoed through the cellar as something heavy slammed into the cabin door. They were trying to break in. Abigail clutched Charlotte tighter, her mind racing. The root cellar had seemed like safety, but now it felt like a tomb. If Montgomery's men found them down here, there would be nowhere to run. Phantom's howl cut through the night like a blade, followed immediately by human screams. The wolf dog had entered the fight, and from the sounds above, he was making Montgomery's men pay dearly for their aggression. "Kill that damn wolf!" someone yelled. "I'm trying. Thing moves like a ghost." More gunshots, more shouts of pain and confusion. Caleb was using the chaos to his advantage, picking off Montgomery's men one by one from whatever cover he'd found. But Abigail could hear in the rhythm of the battle that he was slowly being pushed back, forced to give ground as the attackers closed in. Charlotte's breathing hitched, and Abigail realized the child was trying not to cough. The antibiotics Caleb had given her were working, but her lungs were still fragile. Any loud noise might give away their hiding place. "Hold on, baby," Abigail whispered, pressing her hand gently over Charlotte's mouth. "Just a little longer." The sound of the cabin door finally giving way echoed through the cellar like thunder. Heavy boots stomped across the floor above, accompanied by harsh voices. "Search everything. Check every corner. Montgomery wants proof that Doc's dead and he wants them papers. What about the woman and kid? Dead or alive, don't matter to me, but Montgomery wants to question the woman first if we can manage it." Furniture crashed as the men ransacked the cabin. Abigail could hear them moving systematically through the single room, overturning Caleb's carefully organized medical supplies, ripping books from their shelves. The sound of glass breaking suggested they'd found his collection of medicines. "Hey, Barker," one of the men called out. "Look at all this doc equipment. This hermit's been playing doctor out here." "Makes sense," came the gruff reply. Montgomery always suspected Winters might have survived that fire, been looking for him for years. A new voice joined the conversation, younger and more nervous than the others. Why would Montgomery care about some doctor thought this was about them railroad papers? The older man's laugh was ugly. "Boy, you got a lot to learn about how business works. That doctor there lost his family in a fire that Montgomery arranged. Been a loose end ever since. Man like that with nothing left to lose, he's dangerous. Montgomery don't like loose ends." Abigail closed her eyes, finally understanding the full scope of Montgomery's ruthlessness. This wasn't just about covering up his illegal land grabs. It was about eliminating anyone who might someday seek revenge. Caleb had been marked for death the moment he'd survived that fire 8 years ago. The searchers were getting closer to the fireplace. Abigail could hear them examining the stone hearth, their voices growing louder as they approached the hidden entrance to the root cellar. "This stonework looks funny," one of them said. "Like it's been disturbed recent-like." "Check behind it," Barker ordered. "These old cabins always got hidey holes." Charlotte tensed in her arms, and Abigail knew the child could sense the danger even through her fever-weakened state. The little girl's eyes were wide with fear, but she remained perfectly silent, trusting her mother to protect her. The sound of stones being moved sent ice through Abigail's veins. They'd found the entrance. In minutes, maybe seconds, Montgomery's killers would discover their hiding place. She looked around desperately, but the root cellar was exactly what it appeared to be, a small storage space with no other exits. "Got something here?" the searcher called out excitedly. "Looks like a trap door." Abigail made her decision. She couldn't fight trained killers, but she could give Charlotte a chance. Setting her daughter down gently, she picked up a heavy mason jar from one of the cellar's shelves. "Preserved peaches," the label read in Caleb's careful handwriting. "Charlotte," she whispered urgently, "when I tell you to run, you run straight up those stairs and out the door. Don't look back. Don't wait for me. Find somewhere to hide until the sun comes up, then head toward town. Can you do that?" The child nodded solemnly, understanding with the terrible wisdom that adversity forces on the young that this might be goodbye. The trapdoor above them creaked as someone tested its weight. Lamplight began to filter down through the cracks, followed by the barrel of a rifle. "Well, well," Barker's voice drifted down to them. "Looks like we found ourselves a couple of rats." That's when the cabin exploded. The blast knocked everyone in the root cellar off their feet, sending dirt and debris raining down from above. Through the chaos, Abigail heard men screaming, some in pain, others in confusion and terror. The acrid smell of gunpowder and smoke filled the air. "What the hell?" Barker's voice was cut off by another explosion, this one even closer. Through the ringing in her ears, Abigail heard a new sound, the thunder of approaching hooves. A lot of them, but these weren't Montgomery's men. The riders approaching were moving with military precision, their voices calling out orders with practiced authority. "Secure the perimeter. Smith, take your men around back. Don't let anyone escape." The trapdoor above them slammed shut, as whoever had been trying to come down apparently decided they had more pressing concerns above ground. The sounds of battle had changed completely. Instead of Caleb fighting a desperate rearguard action, there was now a full-scale gun battle raging around the cabin. "Federal marshals," a voice boomed across the clearing. "Throw down your weapons and surrender. You're surrounded." Abigail felt hope surge through her for the first time since the attack began. Federal marshals. But how had they found this place? How had they known to come? The answer came in the form of a familiar voice calling out through the chaos. "Mrs. Turner. Mrs. Turner, if you can hear me, this is James Harrington. You're safe now." Mayor James Harrington, the last person Abigail would have expected to find in these mountains leading a rescue mission. But his voice was unmistakable, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. The battle above was winding down rapidly. Montgomery's men, caught between Caleb's accurate shooting and the marshal's coordinated assault, were surrendering or fleeing into the forest. Within minutes, the cabin had gone from a war zone to something approaching calm. "Charlotte," Abigail whispered, helping her daughter to her feet. "I think we're safe now." The trapdoor opened again, but this time the face that peered down at them was weathered and kindly, with intelligent brown eyes and a neatly trimmed gray beard. "Mrs. Turner," the man asked gently. "I'm Marshal William Crawford. You and your daughter can come up now. It's over." Abigail climbed the ladder first, then turned to help Charlotte up. The cabin was in ruins, furniture, overturned windows, shattered bullet holes in every wall, but the marshals had clearly won the day. Several of Montgomery's men sat against one wall, their hands bound, while others tended to their own wounded. "Abigail," Harrington's voice drew her attention to the doorway where the mayor stood silhouetted against the dawn light. He looked older than she remembered his usually immaculate appearance, rumpled from hard riding, but his smile was genuine with relief. "James," she said wonderingly, what are you doing here?" "Looking for you, of course," he replied, crossing to embrace her carefully. "When word reached Denver that you'd disappeared, I knew Montgomery's people were involved. It took some doing, but we managed to track you this far." "But how did you know about Caleb?" Harrington's expression grew more serious. "We didn't, not exactly. We were following the trail of Montgomery's men when we heard the shooting. Lucky thing too, looks like Dr. Winters here has been having quite an evening." For the first time since emerging from the cellar, Abigail looked around for Caleb. She found him sitting on the floor near the fireplace, his back against the stone hearth. His shirt was torn and bloody, and there was a makeshift bandage around his left arm, but his eyes were alert and focused. "You're hurt," she said, kneeling beside him. "Nothing serious," he replied, though his voice was strained with pain. "Bullet grazed my arm, but I've had worse. Charlotte, she's fine. Better than fine, thanks to you." Abigail glanced at her daughter, who was being examined by one of the marshals with obvious medical training. "The fever's broken completely." Caleb's smile was tired but genuine. "Good, that's good." Phantom appeared at his side, the wolf dog's muzzle stained with blood that clearly wasn't his own. The animal pressed close to Caleb's yellow eyes, scanning the room for any remaining threats. "Easy, boy," Caleb murmured, scratching behind the animal's ears. "We're among friends now." Marshal Crawford approached them, his expression troubled. "Dr. Winters, I need to ask you some questions about what happened here tonight. But first, I think you should know we've been looking for you for a long time." Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. "Looking for me? Why?" "Because," Harrington interjected, "you're the key to bringing down Augustus Montgomery once and for all." The mayor pulled a chair over and sat down facing them, his expression grave. "Abigail, the papers your husband gathered, they're important, yes, but they're not the only evidence against Montgomery. What we need is someone who can testify about the personal crimes, the murders that can't be explained away as business practices. Someone like a doctor whose family was killed in a suspicious fire," Crawford added quietly. Caleb was very still for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "I can't prove anything about that fire. I told you before the official cause was a faulty chimney." "But you know better," Harrington said gently, "and so do we. We've been building a case against Montgomery for months, gathering evidence from multiple sources. The pattern is clear. He's been eliminating anyone who stands in his way for years." "Then why haven't you arrested him?" "Because he's careful," Crawford replied. "Uses intermediates, covers his tracks, but with your testimony combined with Judge Turner's papers and the other evidence we've gathered, we can put him away forever," Harrington finished. "Not just for the land fraud, but for murder, multiple murders." Abigail watched Caleb's face as he processed this information. She could see the war being fought behind his gray eyes, the desire for justice battling against 8 years of hiding, of trying to forget. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Caleb asked finally. "Come back to Denver with us," Harrington said. "Testify before a federal grand jury about what you know, what you suspect. Help us make sure Montgomery can never hurt another family the way he hurt yours. And in return, you get your life back," Crawford said simply. "The chance to practice medicine again, to be the man you were before that fire stole everything from you." Caleb looked at Charlotte, who had fallen asleep in her chair despite the chaos around her. The child's breathing was clear and steady, her color much improved from the night before. "I haven't been a doctor in 8 years," he said quietly. "I don't know if I remember how to be one." "You saved my daughter's life," Abigail said softly. "If that's not being a doctor, I don't know what is." Something shifted in Caleb's expression at her words. The haunted look that had dominated his features began to fade, replaced by something she hadn't seen before. Hope. "There's something else you should know," Harrington said, his voice gentle but urgent. "Montgomery knows you're alive now. After tonight, after what happened here, he'll know you're the Dr. Winters he's been looking for. You can't go back to hiding, Caleb. It's not safe anymore." "Then I guess I don't have much choice," Caleb replied, but there was no bitterness in his voice. If anything, he sounded relieved. Crawford stood up, extending his hand to help Caleb to his feet. "There's a wagon coming up the trail with medical supplies and a proper doctor to check everyone over. We can have you back in Denver within 3 days. "What about my cabin, my things?" "We'll make sure everything's taken care of," the marshal assured him. "This place will be here when you're ready to come back, if you want to come back." Caleb looked around the ruined cabin, taking in the bullet holes and overturned furniture, the scattered books and broken glass. 8 years of solitude, 8 years of trying to forget, reduced to wreckage in a single night. "Maybe it's time for a change anyway," he said softly. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of wheels and harnesses approached the cabin. Through the shattered windows, Abigail could see a medical wagon pulling up, followed by several more riders. The cavalry had truly arrived. "Mrs. Turner," one of the marshals called out, "there's someone here says he needs to speak with you urgent-like." The someone turned out to be a young man in a dust-covered suit, his face flushed with excitement and exhaustion. He carried a leather satchel that he clutched protectively against his chest. "Mrs. Turner," he said breathlessly. "My name is Thomas Benedict. I'm a reporter for the Denver Post. I've been investigating Augustus Montgomery for months, and I have information you need to know." Harrington frowned. "This isn't the time for—" "It is exactly the time," Benedict interrupted, his voice urgent. "Montgomery's not just coming after you for the papers your husband gathered. He's planning something bigger, something that will make all his previous crimes look like child's play." "What are you talking about?" Abigail asked. Benedict opened his satchel and pulled out a thick folder. "3 days ago, I received this from a source inside Montgomery's organization, someone who finally grew a conscience and decided to do the right thing." He handed the folder to Abigail, who opened it with trembling fingers. The papers inside were contracts, correspondence, detailed plans for something called Project Westward. "What is this?" she asked, scanning the dense legal language. "Montgomery's final solution to the Indian problem," Benedict said grimly. "He's planning to provoke a war between the army and the remaining tribal nations. Not just raids or skirmishes, a full-scale war designed to justify the complete removal of all native peoples from railroad territory." The cabin went silent, except for the crackling of the fire and Charlotte's gentle breathing. Even the marshals had stopped their work to listen. "How?" Crawford asked quietly. Benedict pointed to specific documents in the folder. "False flag operations. His men will attack settlements and stage them to look like Indian raids. They'll massacre entire families, burn out homesteaders, create so much terror that the army will have no choice but to respond with overwhelming force." "My God," Harrington whispered. "The scope of it gets worse," Benedict continued. "Once the war starts, Montgomery plans to supply both sides, sell weapons to the tribes through intermediates, then sell supplies to the army, profit from the conflict while ensuring maximum casualties on both sides." Abigail felt sick. The man who had killed her husband, who had murdered Caleb's family, was planning to orchestrate a genocide for profit. "When?" Caleb asked, his voice deadly quiet. "The first attacks are scheduled to begin in 6 days, Benedict replied, starting with a settlement called Cedar Falls about 50 miles north of here. 23 families, including 8 children under the age of 10. "We have to stop him," Abigail said immediately. "We will," Crawford assured her. "With this evidence combined with everything else we have—" "You don't understand," Benedict interrupted. "Montgomery's got people everywhere. Federal judges, army officers, territorial governors. Even if you arrest him tomorrow, there's no guarantee you can stop the plan. His organization is bigger than just him." "Then what do you suggest?" Harrington asked. Benedict's expression was grim. "We expose everything at once. Public testimony, newspaper articles, evidence presented simultaneously in multiple venues. Make it impossible for his people to cover it up or explain it away." "That would require—" Crawford paused, thinking. "Perfect timing, absolute coordination. And someone who can get close to Montgomery himself," Benedict added. "Someone he trusts enough to let his guard down around." All eyes in the cabin turned to Abigail. She felt their expectation like a physical weight, understanding immediately what they were suggesting. "You want me to go back to Denver," she said slowly. "Let Montgomery think he's won, that he's captured me." "It's too dangerous," Caleb said immediately. "After what happened here, he'll never believe you just surrendered willingly." "He will if I bring him what he wants most," Abigail replied, her mind racing. "The papers David hid, the evidence he's been searching for." "But those papers are hidden where only I can find them," she finished. "Montgomery knows that. He needs me alive at least long enough to recover David's evidence." "It's still too risky," Harrington protested. "If something goes wrong, if he suspects—" "Then we make sure nothing goes wrong," Abigail said firmly. "And we make sure I'm not going in alone." She looked at Caleb, seeing understanding dawn in his gray eyes. "You're thinking what I'm thinking," she said. "That Dr. Caleb Winters is dead," he replied slowly. "Killed in the attack on this cabin along with Mrs. Turner and her daughter." "Exactly. But a new family could arrive in Denver, maybe a traveling doctor and his wife with their sick daughter. Maybe they heard there were opportunities in the territory for a man with medical skills." Crawford was shaking his head. "The risk is necessary." Benedict interrupted. This is bigger than just catching Montgomery. If Project Westward succeeds, thousands of people will die. Entire tribes could be wiped out. And if we fail, Harrington asked quietly. Then they die anyway, Abigail replied. At least this way they have a chance. Charlotte stirred in her chair, mumbling something in her sleep. The sound reminded everyone present of what was really at stake, not just justice for past crimes, but the lives of innocent people who had no idea they were about to become pawns in Montgomery's deadly game. There's one more thing, Benedict said reluctantly. My source inside Montgomery's organization, they're taking a huge risk by helping us. If Montgomery discovers who's been feeding us information. Who is it? Crawford asked. Benedict hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. Montgomery's own son, Marcus Montgomery. He's been working with his father for years, but lately, he shrugged. Even family loyalty has its limits. The revelation sent a shock through the cabin. Montgomery's own son was working against him, providing the evidence that could bring down the entire conspiracy. All the more reason to move quickly, Harrington said. If Montgomery suspects his son's involvement, he's already suspicious, Benedict replied grimly. Marcus thinks he has maybe a week before his father figures it out. After that, Marcus Montgomery is a dead man, Caleb finished quietly. Along with everyone else who stands in Augustus Montgomery's way, Abigail added. She stood up, decision crystallizing in her mind. When do we leave for Denver? Abigail, Harrington began. When? She repeated firmly. Crawford exchanged a look with the other marshal, then nodded slowly. The wagon's already hitched. If we leave within the hour, we can be in Denver by tomorrow evening. Good. Abigail moved to wake Charlotte, then paused. There's just one thing. If we're going to do this, if we're going to risk everything to stop Montgomery, then we do it right. No half measures, no backup plans. We end this once and for all. Agreed, Caleb said, struggling to his feet despite his wounded arm. Then let's go stop a war. Abigail said softly, lifting her daughter into her arms. Outside, dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It should have been beautiful, a new beginning after the long nightmare of the past few hours. Instead, Abigail found herself thinking of all the dawns that would never come if Montgomery's plan succeeded, all the families who would never see another sunrise. She had been beaten 100 times, but she had never been broken. Now, for the first time in her life, she had the chance to strike back, and she intended to make it count. The wagon wheels churned through the muddy streets of Denver as storm clouds gathered overhead, matching the tension that had been building during their 2-day journey from the mountains. Abigail sat rigidly beside Caleb on the driver's bench, Charlotte sleeping fitfully between them despite the rough ride. The child's recovery had been remarkable, but the stress of constant travel was taking its toll on her small frame. Remember, Marshal Crawford called softly from horseback beside them. As far as anyone knows, you're Dr. Samuel Hayes and his wife, Margaret. Your daughter is Mary, and you're here looking for opportunities to establish a medical practice. Caleb nodded, his jaw tight with concentration. The transformation had been remarkable. Gone was the hermit's rough beard and wild hair, replaced by the neat appearance of a respectable physician. But Abigail could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the reins just a little too tightly. The hardest part will be the first contact, Harrington had warned them before they'd entered the city limits. Montgomery's people will be watching for any new arrivals, especially anyone who might be connected to medicine. If they suspect you're Dr. Winters, they won't, Abigail had replied with more confidence than she felt. Caleb's been hiding for 8 years. His own mother wouldn't recognize him now. But as they rolled through the familiar streets of Denver, past the grand hotels and bustling businesses that represented Augustus Montgomery's growing empire, Abigail felt doubt creeping into her chest like ice water. Everything depended on their ability to convince one of the most ruthless men in the territory that they were exactly what they appeared to be, desperate travelers seeking a new start. There, Crawford pointed discreetly toward a modest boarding house on a quiet side street. Mrs. Patterson's place. She's been told to expect a traveling doctor and his family. She'll ask no questions and remember even less. The boarding house was perfect for their purposes, respectable enough to maintain their cover, but not so prominent as to attract unwanted attention. As Caleb helped Abigail down from the wagon, she caught sight of their reflection in the boarding house window. They looked exactly like what they claimed to be a young family seeking opportunity in the growing frontier town. Dr. Hayes. The voice belonged to a matronly woman in her 50s who emerged from the boarding house with a welcoming smile. I'm Mrs. Patterson. We've been expecting you. Thank you for accommodating us on such short notice, Caleb replied, his voice carrying just the right note of weary gratitude. The journey from Kansas has been difficult. Of course, Mrs. Patterson fussed, immediately taking charge of Charlotte. And this little angel must be exhausted. I've prepared your finest room with a proper bed for the child. As they followed Mrs. Patterson inside, Abigail caught a glimpse of a man in an expensive suit watching them from across the street. He studied them for a long moment before disappearing into an alley, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. We're being watched already, she murmured to Caleb as they climbed the stairs to their room. I know, he replied quietly. Means Montgomery's people are efficient. That's both good and bad for us. Their room was simple but clean, with a view of the main street that would allow them to monitor comings and goings. As soon as Mrs. Patterson left them alone, Caleb moved to the window and carefully studied the buildings across the street. 3 watchers that I can see, he reported softly. Maybe more. Word's going to reach Montgomery within the hour that there's a new doctor in town. Good, Abigail said, settling Charlotte on the bed. The sooner he knows about us, the sooner we can get close to him. And the sooner we can get ourselves killed, Caleb pointed out grimly. Charlotte stirred on the bed, her eyes fluttering open. Mama, where are we? We're in Denver, sweetheart, Abigail said, gently smoothing her daughter's hair. Remember I told you we were coming to see the big city. Are the bad men gone? Abigail and Caleb exchanged a look. The child had been through so much, had seen things no 6-year-old should ever witness. How could they explain that the worst was yet to come? The bad men from the mountains are gone, Abigail said carefully, but we still need to be very careful and very brave. Can you do that for Mama? Charlotte nodded solemnly, the terrible wisdom of a child who had learned too young that the world was not always safe. A knock at the door interrupted them. Caleb's hand moved instinctively toward the gun hidden beneath his coat, but the voice that called out was Mrs. Patterson's. Dr. Hayes, there's a gentleman downstairs to see you, says he heard there was a new physician in town. Abigail felt her pulse quicken. It was beginning already. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. Dr. Hayes will be right down. Caleb straightened his coat and checked his appearance in the small mirror above the wash basin. When he turned back to face them, he was no longer Caleb Winters, the broken hermit hiding from his past. He was Dr. Samuel Hayes, confident and professional, exactly the kind of man who would impress someone like Augustus Montgomery. Stay here with Charlotte, he said quietly. If anything goes wrong... Nothing will go wrong, Abigail said firmly. You're a doctor meeting a potential patient, nothing more complicated than that. But as Caleb left the room, Abigail moved to the window and watched the street below with growing anxiety. She could see more watchers now, men who tried to look casual as they loitered near storefronts and alleyways. Montgomery's net was closing around them faster than she'd anticipated. Downstairs in the boarding house parlor, Caleb found himself face to face with a well-dressed man in his 30s. The stranger had the soft look of someone who'd never missed a meal, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. Dr. Hayes. The man extended his hand with practiced charm. I'm Robert Sinclair, assistant to Mr. Augustus Montgomery. I understand you're new to our fair city. That's correct, Caleb replied, accepting the handshake. My family and I are considering Denver as a place to establish a practice. I've heard there are opportunities here for a skilled physician. Indeed there are, Sinclair agreed. Mr. Montgomery is always interested in supporting quality medical professionals. In fact, he's been looking for a doctor to serve as personal physician to his family and business associates. The offer came faster than Caleb had expected, almost suspiciously so. That's very generous, but I prefer to evaluate all my options before making any commitments. Of course, Sinclair said smoothly. Perhaps you'd be willing to demonstrate your skills. As it happens, Mr. Montgomery has been suffering from some troubling symptoms lately. Nothing serious, I'm sure, but he values expert medical opinion. I'd be happy to examine Mr. Montgomery, Caleb replied. When would be convenient? This evening, if possible. Mr. Montgomery dislikes delay when his health is concerned. Caleb nodded thoughtfully. This evening would be acceptable. Where shall I meet him? His estate is on the outskirts of town. I'll send a carriage for you at 7 o'clock. Sinclair paused, studying Caleb's face. I trust your family won't mind the brief separation. My wife understands the demands of medical practice, Caleb said carefully, though I should mention that my daughter has been ill. Nothing contagious, but she may need attention during the night. I'm sure Mrs. Patterson can recommend a local physician if needed, Sinclair replied. Though perhaps if your examination of Mr. Montgomery goes well, such concerns will be unnecessary. The implied threat was subtle, but clear. Demonstrate your value or lose access to proper medical care for your child. Caleb felt anger flare in his chest but kept his expression neutral. I understand completely, he said. I'll be ready at 7. After Sinclair left, Caleb remained in the parlor for several minutes processing what had just occurred. Montgomery was moving faster than anyone had anticipated, almost as if he suspected something. The offer of employment, the implied threats, the insistence on an immediate examination, none of it felt like coincidence. When he returned to their room, he found Abigail pacing anxiously while Charlotte played quietly with a rag doll Mrs. Patterson had provided. How did it go? Abigail asked immediately. Too well, Caleb replied grimly. Montgomery wants to see me tonight, at his estate. Tonight? Abigail's face paled. That's too fast, we're not ready. Ready or not, it's happening, Caleb said. His assistant made it clear that refusing wasn't an option. Did he suspect anything? Hard to tell. Either Montgomery's always this eager to recruit new doctors, or he knows more than we'd like. Abigail sank into a chair, her mind racing. If he knows who you are, if this is a trap, then we spring it on our terms instead of his, Caleb said firmly. I'm going to that meeting, Abigail. It's the only way to get close enough to him. Not alone you're not. Abigail. No, she said forcefully. We agreed we were doing this together. I'm not letting you walk into Montgomery's lair by yourself. How do you propose to accomplish that? He's expecting a doctor, not a doctor and his wife. Abigail was quiet for a moment, then smiled grimly. He's expecting Dr. Samuel Hayes, but what if Dr. Hayes needs to bring his medical assistant? What if his wife happens to be trained in nursing? It's too dangerous, Caleb protested. If something goes wrong, if he recognizes you. He won't, Abigail said confidently. Augustus Montgomery has never seen me up close. He knows Abigail Turner, the judge's widow. He doesn't know Margaret Hayes, the traveling nurse. And Charlotte stays here with Mrs. Patterson. The fewer people in danger, the better. They spent the remaining hours of the afternoon preparing for the evening's encounter. Harrington had provided them with a small medical bag containing the tools a traveling doctor might carry, along with several vials of harmless substances that would pass for medicines. More importantly, he'd given them a detailed layout of Montgomery's estate, including the location of his private office where the most sensitive documents were likely kept. Remember, Crawford had warned them Montgomery's smart and ruthless, but he's also arrogant. He believes his money and influence make him untouchable. Use that against him. As the sun began to set over Denver, casting long shadows across the streets, Abigail transformed herself into Margaret Hayes. Gone was the desperate widow who'd fled through the storm. In her place stood a competent professional woman who happened to assist her husband in his medical practice. You look perfect, Caleb said admiringly, like you were born to the role. I've been pretending to be someone else my whole life, Abigail replied quietly. This is just one more performance. At exactly 7 o'clock, an elegant carriage pulled up outside the boarding house. The driver was a large man with cold eyes who looked more like a bodyguard than a coachman. He studied them both carefully as they approached. Dr. Hayes? He asked in a voice like gravel. That's correct, Caleb replied. And this is my assistant, Mrs. Hayes. The driver's eyes lingered on Abigail for a moment longer than necessary. Mr. Montgomery wasn't expecting a second party. Medical examinations sometimes require assistance, Caleb said smoothly. Surely Mr. Montgomery understands the importance of proper procedure. After a moment's hesitation, the driver nodded and opened the carriage door. Mr. Montgomery understands many things, Doctor. We'll see how understanding he feels tonight. The ride to Montgomery's estate took them through the wealthiest part of Denver, past mansions that rivaled anything in San Francisco or New York. As they climbed into the foothills, the houses grew larger and more isolated until finally they turned through ornate iron gates bearing the Montgomery family crest. The estate itself was magnificent, a sprawling mansion that spoke of unlimited wealth and absolute power. Gas lamps lined the circular drive, and Abigail could see armed guards positioned discreetly around the grounds. This wasn't just a home. It was a fortress. "Impressive," Caleb murmured as they stepped down from the carriage. "Intimidating is more like it," Abigail replied softly. "He wants visitors to feel small before they even meet him." They were escorted through a grand foyer decorated with hunting trophies and expensive artwork, then down a corridor lined with portraits of Montgomery ancestors. Finally, they were shown into a lavishly appointed study where Augustus Montgomery himself waited to receive them. The man was smaller than Abigail had expected, perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes. But there was something in those eyes that made her skin crawl, a coldness that spoke of a man who viewed other human beings as obstacles to be removed or tools to be used. "Dr. Hayes." Montgomery rose from behind an enormous desk, extending his hand in greeting. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, and Mrs. Hayes, an unexpected pleasure." His grip was firm but brief, and Abigail noticed that his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging details, searching for anything out of place. "Mr. Montgomery," Caleb replied formally, "I understand you've been experiencing some health concerns." "Nothing serious, I'm sure," Montgomery said, gesturing for them to sit in leather chairs positioned in front of his desk. "But a man in my position can't afford to take chances with his health. Too many people depend on me." "Of course," Caleb agreed. "Perhaps you could describe your symptoms." As Montgomery began detailing his supposed ailments, headaches, difficulty sleeping, occasional chest pains, Abigail let her eyes wander around the study. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and safes, any of which might contain the evidence they needed. But more interesting was the man himself. Augustus Montgomery was performing just as much as they were. The symptoms he described were vague and generic, the kind any person might experience. He wasn't really interested in medical care. He was evaluating them, testing their reactions, looking for any sign that they weren't what they appeared to be. "I see," Caleb said when Montgomery finished his recitation. "With your permission, I'd like to conduct a physical examination. Mrs. Hayes, would you prepare the instruments?" Abigail moved to the medical bag, using the activity as an excuse to position herself closer to Montgomery's desk. From the corner of her eye, she could see papers scattered across the surface, correspondence contracts, what looked like maps. One document caught her attention, a telegram dated that very day bearing the header, "Cedar Falls Operation." Her blood ran cold. Cedar Falls was the settlement Benedict had warned them about, the first target in Montgomery's plan to provoke a war. If the telegram was dated today, it meant the attack was imminent. "Mrs. Hayes." Montgomery's voice cut through her thoughts. "Is something wrong?" "Not at all," she replied smoothly, returning to the medical bag. "I was just ensuring we have everything needed for a thorough examination." But Montgomery was studying her face now, his eyes sharp and calculating. "You know, Mrs. Hayes, you look familiar. Have we met before?" Abigail's heart stopped, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't believe so, Mr. Montgomery, though perhaps you knew my family. We lived in Kansas before coming here." "Kansas?" Montgomery repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I have business interests there. What was your family name?" The question was a trap, and they both knew it. If she gave him a real name, he might be able to verify it. If she lied, he might catch her in the deception. "Whitman," she said finally. "My father was a farmer near Topeka." Montgomery nodded slowly, but his eyes never left her face. "Whitman. Yes, I believe I may have known some Whitmans. Small world, isn't it?" "Indeed it is," Abigail agreed, turning back to the medical instruments with hands that she willed not to shake. Caleb had begun his examination of Montgomery, checking his pulse and listening to his breathing with professional competence. But Abigail could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set just a little too tight. He'd sensed the danger, too. "Your heart sounds strong, Mr. Montgomery," Caleb said, stepping back. "Pulse is steady, breathing clear. The symptoms you've described could be related to stress or diet." "Stress?" Montgomery laughed. "Yes, I suppose running a business empire does create certain pressures. Tell me, doctor, what brings you to Denver? Surely a man of your obvious skills could establish a practice anywhere." "Opportunity," Caleb replied. Denver is growing rapidly, and I believe there's room for a physician who understands the needs of successful businessmen like yourself. Ambitious, Montgomery observed. I like that in a man. In fact, I may have a proposition for you. He moved to one of the filing cabinets and withdrew a thick folder. I'm involved in several development projects that take me into remote areas of the territory, dangerous places where accidents can happen, where medical care might be needed on short notice. He opened the folder, revealing maps marked with locations throughout Colorado and the surrounding territories. Abigail recognized several of the marked sites. They corresponded to Native American settlements and isolated homesteads. I need a doctor who can travel with my survey teams, Montgomery continued. Someone discreet, someone who understands that certain aspects of frontier business require confidentiality. What kind of confidentiality? Caleb asked carefully. Montgomery's smile was cold as winter. The kind that keeps a man alive and prosperous, doctor. The kind that recognizes when it's better not to ask questions about what one might see or treat in the field. The offer was chilling in its implications. Montgomery wasn't just recruiting a physician, he was recruiting an accomplice, someone who would treat the wounds his men inflicted without reporting them to authorities. That's quite an offer, Caleb said slowly. When would such an arrangement begin? Immediately, if you're willing. In fact, there's a survey expedition leaving tomorrow morning for a place called Cedar Falls, remote settlement about 50 miles north. Perfect opportunity for you to demonstrate your discretion. Abigail felt ice flood her veins. Tomorrow morning. The attack on Cedar Falls was happening tomorrow, and Montgomery was offering Caleb a front-row seat to the massacre. I'm honored by your confidence, Caleb replied, but I'd need time to consider such a significant commitment. Perhaps we could discuss terms. Of course, Montgomery agreed. Though I should mention that positions of trust in my organization are rare and valuable. Men who disappoint me tend to find Denver a very unfriendly place. The threat was barely veiled, but before either of them could respond, the study door burst open. A young man in his 20s rushed in, his face flushed with panic. Father, we need to talk, he said urgently. There's been a development with the... He stopped abruptly, noticing Caleb and Abigail. I'm sorry, I didn't realize you had company. Marcus, Montgomery's voice carried a warning. These are Dr. and Mrs. Hayes. Perhaps your urgent matter can wait. But Abigail was studying the young man's face, recognizing the features from Benedict's description. This was Marcus Montgomery, their secret ally, the source of information that had brought them to Denver. Actually, Marcus said, his eyes meeting Abigail's for just a moment, this concerns the Cedar Falls survey. I thought Dr. Hayes might want to know about the medical preparations required. The look that passed between father and son was charged with tension. Montgomery's eyes narrowed as he studied his son's face, clearly sensing something beneath the surface. What kind of medical preparations? Montgomery asked slowly. Well, Marcus replied, his voice carefully controlled. If we're surveying in hostile territory, there's always the possibility of Indian attacks. Dr. Hayes would need to be prepared to treat arrow wounds, scalp injuries, that sort of thing. The young man was trying to warn them, Abigail realized. He was telling them as clearly as he dared what kind of violence they could expect to witness if Caleb joined tomorrow's expedition. I see, Caleb said thoughtfully. That does sound like challenging medical work. Perhaps Mrs. Hayes and I should discuss this privately before making a decision. Of course, Montgomery agreed, but there was something new in his voice, suspicion calculation. Marcus, escort our guests to the library while they consider my offer. I'll join you shortly. As they left the study, Abigail caught a glimpse of Montgomery reaching for a different folder on his desk. Her blood chilled as she saw the name written on the tab. Turner David, Federal Investigation. Montgomery knew exactly who they were. In the library, Marcus closed the door behind them and immediately moved to the windows, checking to ensure they weren't being observed. You need to leave, he said urgently, now before my father figures out who you really are. How long do we have? Caleb asked quietly. Maybe 10 minutes, Marcus replied. He's probably checking telegraph records right now, verifying your story about coming from Kansas, when he doesn't find any Dr. Samuel Hayes from Topeka. The attack on Cedar Falls, Abigail interrupted. When exactly is it happening? Marcus looked stricken. Dawn tomorrow. 23 families, just like your reporter friend said. My father's men are already in position. Can you stop it? Not without exposing myself, Marcus said desperately. But maybe you can. There's a back way out of the estate through the servants' quarters. If you can get to Cedar Falls before dawn. We'll never make it in time, Caleb said grimly. 50 miles in one night over mountain roads. You could if you had help, Marcus said, moving to a writing desk and quickly scribbling a note. Take this to Sheriff Duncan at the Territorial Marshal's office. Tell him Marcus Montgomery sent you and that Operation Westward is beginning. Sheriff Duncan, Abigail asked, can he be trusted? He's one of the few lawmen my father doesn't own, Marcus replied. Duncan's been building a case against the railroad for months, but he's never had enough evidence to act. Footsteps in the corridor outside made them all freeze. Montgomery's voice could be heard giving orders to his men, the tone urgent and commanding. Go, Marcus whispered, pointing toward a door at the far end of the library. That leads to the servants' stair. Follow it down and exit through the kitchen. There's a stable about a quarter mile down the mountain road. The marshal's men have horses waiting there. What about you? Abigail asked. Marcus's smile was grim. I'll buy you as much time as I can, maybe suggest that you've gone to your room to consider the offer. Marcus, Caleb said quietly, your father's going to know you warned us. I know, the young man replied. I've known this day would come since I started working with your people. Maybe it's time I stopped being my father's son and started being my own man. The footsteps were getting closer. Abigail quickly kissed Marcus on the cheek, a gesture of gratitude and farewell. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Save those families, Marcus replied. Marcus, that's all the thanks I need. They slipped through the door just as Montgomery's voice boomed in the corridor outside, calling for his guards to search the estate. Their masquerade was over, but the real mission was just beginning. As they crept down the servants' stair, Abigail felt a familiar fire burning in her chest. She'd been beaten down, hunted and threatened, but she had never been broken. And now, for the first time, she had the chance to strike back against the man who had taken everything from her. 23 families were sleeping peacefully in Cedar Falls tonight, unaware that death was riding toward them with the dawn. But if she and Caleb could reach Sheriff Duncan in time, if they could convince him to act on Marcus's information, those families might live to see another sunset. The mountain night was cold and dark as they emerged from the kitchen, but Abigail had never felt more alive. The hunted were about to become the hunters, and Augustus Montgomery was about to learn that some people could not be bought broken or silenced. The war for justice was finally beginning. The stable emerged from the darkness like a sanctuary, its weathered wooden walls barely visible against the mountainside. Abigail's lungs burned from their desperate flight down the rocky path, and beside her, Caleb moved with the careful precision of a man fighting through pain from his wounded arm. Behind them, the lights of Montgomery's estate blazed like angry stars, and the sound of pursuing horses grew steadily closer. There, Caleb whispered, pointing toward a shadow that detached itself from the stable wall. Marshal's man. The figure approached cautiously, rifle ready. Dr. Winters. Mrs. Turner. That's us. Abigail gasped, still catching her breath. Marcus Montgomery sent us. We need to reach Sheriff Duncan immediately. The marshal's deputy, a lean man with intelligent eyes, nodded grimly. Name's Deputy Williams. Been waiting here since sunset, hoping you'd make it out alive. He gestured toward the stable. Got fresh horses saddled and ready, but I have to warn you, Montgomery's men are already moving. Whatever you're planning, it better happen fast. Inside the stable, 2 magnificent horses waited, their saddles gleaming with fresh oil and their eyes bright with anticipation. These weren't the tired mounts of desperate fugitives, but the carefully selected war horses of professional lawmen. How far to town? Caleb asked, checking the cinch on his saddle. 6 miles of hard riding, Williams replied. But the road's good and these horses know the way. Sheriff Duncan's waiting at his office with a telegraph key and 20 armed deputies. As they mounted, the sound of pursuit grew closer. Montgomery's men were spreading out across the mountains, systematically searching every path and hiding place. Soon they would reach the stable. Go, Williams said urgently. I'll hold them here as long as I can. What about you? Abigail asked. I'll be fine, the deputy replied with a grim smile. Been planning my retirement anyway. Now ride. They burst from the stable into the moonlit night, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the rocky ground. Behind them, William's rifle cracked once, twice, three times in rapid succession, each shot carefully aimed to slow their pursuers without killing them unnecessarily. The mountain road was treacherous in the darkness, winding through stands of pine and aspen that cast shifting shadows across their path. But their horses were sure-footed and strong-bred for exactly this kind of desperate midnight ride. "How much time do we have?" Abigail called over the thunder of hoofbeats. "Maybe 4 hours until dawn," Caleb replied, leaning low over his horse's neck. "If Montgomery's men are already in position at Cedar Falls." "Then we stop them," Abigail said fiercely, "whatever it takes." They rode in desperate silence after that, focused entirely on the treacherous path ahead. Every minute counted now, every second could mean the difference between life and death for 23 innocent families. The lights of Denver appeared below them like scattered jewels, and Abigail felt a surge of hope. They'd made it this far. Now everything depended on Sheriff Duncan and whether he would believe the incredible story they were about to tell him. The territorial marshal's office occupied a sturdy brick building on the main street, its windows blazing with lamplight despite the late hour. As they reined in their horses, the front door opened and a tall man with a badge stepped out to meet them. "Dr. Winters, Mrs. Turner," Sheriff Duncan said without preamble. "Deputy Williams telegraphed ahead. You've got exactly 3 minutes to convince me to mobilize every lawman in the territory." "Then we'd better talk fast," Abigail said, dismounting quickly, "because Augustus Montgomery is about to start a war." Inside the marshal's office, maps covered every available surface marked with red pins that showed the locations of Montgomery's various business interests. Sheriff Duncan was a man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He listened without interruption as Caleb and Abigail laid out the full scope of Montgomery's plan. "Project Westward," Duncan said when they finished, his voice grim. "We've suspected something like this for months, but we could never prove it." "Marcus Montgomery can prove it," Abigail said urgently. "He's been feeding information to reporter Benedict for weeks. Everything you need to build a case." "If he's still alive," Duncan replied grimly. "Augustus Montgomery doesn't forgive betrayal, especially from family." The sheriff moved to a large telegraph key in the corner of the office and began tapping out a rapid message. "I'm calling in every favor I have," he explained. "Federal Marshals, Army units, territorial rangers. If we can coordinate this right, we can stop the Cedar Falls attack and arrest Montgomery's entire organization in one sweep." "What about the families at Cedar Falls?" Caleb asked. "Even if we warn them, they're isolated, defenseless. Not as defenseless as Montgomery thinks," Duncan replied with satisfaction. "Turns out the Army's been conducting training exercises in that area for the past week. 2 full companies of cavalry just sitting there waiting for something interesting to happen." Hope flared in Abigail's chest. "You knew—" "We suspected," Duncan corrected. "Marcus Montgomery's information helped us put the pieces together, but we needed confirmation. Your escape tonight provided that." The telegraph key began chattering with incoming messages, and Duncan's expression grew increasingly satisfied as he read them. "Federal Judge Harrison is issuing arrest warrants as we speak," he reported. "Based on the evidence your husband gathered and Marcus Montgomery's testimony, we have enough to charge Augustus Montgomery with murder, conspiracy, fraud, and treason." "Treason?" Abigail asked. "Attempting to provoke an unauthorized war with sovereign tribal nations," Duncan explained. "That's a federal crime punishable by death." More messages arrived, each one adding to the growing sense that justice was finally within reach. But Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that Montgomery was too smart and too ruthless to be caught so easily. "Sheriff," she said slowly, "what if Montgomery has a backup plan? What if Project Westward is just one part of something bigger?" Duncan looked up from the telegraph messages, his expression troubled. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Augustus Montgomery didn't build an empire by putting all his eggs in one basket," Abigail replied. "If we stop the Cedar Falls attack, if we arrest his men, what's to prevent him from starting over somewhere else?" "The evidence against him is overwhelming," Duncan said. "Once we make the arrests public, he'll disappear." Caleb interrupted, understanding Abigail's concern. "Men like Montgomery always have escape routes prepared. Safe houses, hidden assets, loyal followers who'll help him start over." "Then what do you suggest?" Duncan asked. Abigail was quiet for a moment, thinking furiously. Outside, she could hear the sound of horses in the street as more lawmen arrived to join the coordinated effort against Montgomery's organization. "We need him alive," she said finally. Not just arrested, but alive and talking. He's the only one who knows the full extent of his network, the only one who can identify all his collaborators. Getting him alive won't be easy, Duncan warned. Montgomery's the type to fight to the death rather than face a rope. Then we give him a reason to live, Abigail replied. We offer him something he wants more than freedom. Like what? Like his son's life. The suggestion sent a chill through the room. Duncan and Caleb both stared at her, understanding the implications of what she was proposing. You want to use Marcus as bait, Caleb said quietly. Marcus is already bait, Abigail replied. The moment his father discovered his betrayal, he became a dead man. But if we can convince Montgomery that cooperating is the only way to save his son, it might work, Duncan admitted reluctantly, but it's incredibly dangerous, for Marcus and for anyone involved in the deception. Everything we've done so far has been dangerous, Abigail pointed out, but this is our chance to end it completely, to make sure Montgomery can never hurt another family. The telegraph key began chattering again, and Duncan moved to read the incoming message. His face went pale as he deciphered the code. What is it? Caleb asked. Montgomery's escaped, Duncan said grimly. Apparently he suspected something was wrong and slipped away from his estate before our men could surround it. He's in the wind. Abigail felt her heart sink. They'd been so close to ending the nightmare that had consumed her life for months. What about Marcus? She asked. No sign of him either, Duncan replied. Could be dead, could be hiding, could be with his father. No way to know. Then we stick to the original plan, Caleb said firmly. Stop the Cedar Falls attack, arrest whoever we can, build the case piece by piece. No, Abigail said quietly. That's not enough anymore. Both men turned to look at her, and she could see the questions in their eyes, but Abigail's mind was already racing ahead, formulating a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. Montgomery's escaped, but he doesn't know how much we know, she said slowly. He doesn't know about the federal warrants, doesn't know about the army units at Cedar Falls. As far as he's concerned, we're still just two fugitives who got lucky. So, Duncan asked. So we let him think that, Abigail replied. We let him believe his plan is still intact, that he just needs to eliminate us to proceed safely. You want to use yourself as bait, Caleb said, his voice tight with concern. I want to use his obsession with the papers David hid, Abigail corrected. Montgomery spent months hunting for those documents because he knows they can destroy him. If he thinks he can get them, he'll come out of hiding, Duncan finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. Take the risk of exposing himself for one final grab at the evidence. Exactly, Abigail said. But we have to make it look real. He has to believe he's in control, that he's manipulating us instead of the other way around. Where are the papers? Caleb asked. Your husband's evidence? Abigail smiled grimly. Hidden in the one place Montgomery would never think to look, the Denver Public Library, tucked inside a law book that hasn't been checked out in 20 years. Clever, Duncan admitted. But if we're going to use them as bait, we need to make Montgomery believe he's getting the real thing. Oh, he will be, Abigail said, but not until after we have him exactly where we want him. The next hour was spent in careful planning, coordinating with federal marshals and army units to ensure that when Montgomery finally revealed himself, he would be completely surrounded. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Montgomery's own greed and paranoia would be used against him. There's still the matter of timing, Duncan pointed out. The Cedar Falls attack is supposed to happen at dawn. Even if Montgomery's not there to oversee it personally, his men might proceed without him. They won't, Abigail said confidently. Montgomery's too much of a control freak to delegate something this important. If he's not there to give the final order, his men will wait. And if you're wrong, then we pray the army's ready for them. As if summoned by their conversation, the telegraph key began chattering with an urgent message. Duncan decoded it quickly, his expression growing increasingly grim. What now? Caleb asked. Message from the army unit at Cedar Falls, Duncan replied. They report movement in the hills around the settlement, armed men taking positions, but no attack yet. See, Abigail said. They're waiting for orders from Montgomery, which gives us the leverage we need. It also means we're running out of time, Duncan pointed out. Montgomery won't wait forever, especially if he suspects a trap. Abigail moved to the window and looked out at the pre-dawn darkness. Somewhere out there, Augustus Montgomery was making his own plans, probably assuming that his wealth and influence would protect him as they always had. He was about to learn how wrong he was. "How long until sunrise?" she asked. "Maybe 2 hours," Duncan replied. "If we're going to do this, we need to move soon." "Then let's end this," Abigail said firmly. "Send word to Montgomery that we want to negotiate. Tell him we're willing to trade David's papers for safe passage out of the territory." "He'll never believe you'd give up that easily," Caleb protested. "He will if I sweeten the deal," Abigail replied. "Tell him I'm also offering something else. He wants Dr. Caleb Winters alive and ready to confess to murdering his men at the cabin." "Absolutely not," Caleb said immediately. "I'm not letting you sacrifice yourself to get to Montgomery." "I'm not sacrificing myself," Abigail said calmly. "I'm offering him exactly what he wants most: revenge and the evidence that can destroy him. He won't be able to resist. And when he realizes it's a trap, by then it'll be too late," Duncan said, understanding the plan completely. "The moment Montgomery shows himself, we'll have him." The plan was dangerous, but it was also their best chance of ending Montgomery's reign of terror permanently. As Duncan began composing the message that would draw Montgomery into the open, Abigail felt a familiar mixture of fear and determination settle over her. She'd been running from Augustus Montgomery for months, always one step ahead of his killers, always looking over her shoulder. But now, for the first time, she was the hunter instead of the hunted, and she intended to make sure that when this was over, no other family would suffer the way hers had. "There's one more thing," she said as Duncan finished the message. "When Montgomery comes for the exchange, I want to be the one to face him." "Abigail," Caleb began. "No," she said firmly. "This started with David's murder and the attack on our family. It's going to end with me looking Augustus Montgomery in the eye when he realizes he's lost everything." Duncan nodded slowly. "I understand, but you won't be facing him alone. We'll have sharpshooters positioned around the exchange site, federal marshals in place to move in the moment we have him." "Good," Abigail said, "because Augustus Montgomery has spent his whole life believing that money and power make him untouchable. It's time he learned that some things can't be bought and some people can't be broken." As the message went out over the telegraph lines carrying their offer to Montgomery's known associates, Abigail felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she would finally have the chance to strike back against the man who had taken everything from her. The hunted was about to become the hunter, and Augustus Montgomery was about to discover that his greatest weakness wasn't his greed or his cruelty. It was his absolute certainty that he would always win. That certainty was about to be shattered forever. The response came faster than anyone had expected. Montgomery's message was brief and to the point. He would meet them at the old mining camp outside Denver in 1 hour with Marcus as proof of his good faith. The location was perfect for their purposes, isolated enough to avoid civilian casualties, but close enough for backup to arrive quickly when needed. "He's bringing Marcus," Duncan said, studying the telegram. "That could complicate things." "Or simplify them," Abigail replied. "If Marcus is still alive, it means Montgomery still has some use for him. And if Montgomery still needs his son, then he might be willing to negotiate for real," Caleb finished, "which gives us more leverage than we thought." The mining camp was a relic from Denver's early days, abandoned when the easily accessible silver played out. Now it was just a collection of crumbling buildings and rusted equipment, perfect for a clandestine meeting between enemies who had been circling each other for months. As they prepared to leave the marshal's office, Abigail caught Caleb studying her face with obvious concern. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "Duncan's men can handle Montgomery without putting you at risk." "Yes, I do," Abigail replied firmly. "This isn't just about stopping Montgomery anymore. It's about proving that the families he destroyed meant something, that their lives had value. David, your Sarah, and the girls, all the others, they deserve to see justice done. And if something goes wrong..." Abigail was quiet for a moment, thinking of Charlotte sleeping safely at the boarding house, unaware that her mother was about to face the man who had murdered her father. "Then, at least she'll know I tried," Abigail said finally, "that I didn't spend the rest of my life running and hiding." The ride to the mining camp took them through the outskirts of Denver, past sleeping houses and silent businesses. In a few hours, the city would wake to news that would shake the territory to its foundations. Augustus Montgomery, the man who had seemed untouchable, would finally face justice for his crimes. At least that was the plan. The mining camp appeared in the pre-dawn darkness like something from a nightmare, all twisted shadows and abandoned dreams. Sheriff Duncan's men were already in position hidden among the ruins with orders to wait for his signal before moving in. "Remember?" Duncan said as they approached the designated meeting spot. "Let Montgomery talk first. The more he reveals about his organization, the stronger our case becomes. And if he tries to run, he won't get far," Duncan replied grimly. "We have this place surrounded." Abigail dismounted near the largest of the abandoned buildings, her heart pounding, but her resolve steady. Somewhere in the darkness, Augustus Montgomery was approaching with his son and whatever men he trusted most. Soon, the long nightmare that had begun with David's murder would finally end. The sound of approaching horses echoed across the abandoned camp, and Abigail took her position near the ruined mine entrance. Caleb stood beside her, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, while Duncan and his men remained hidden in the shadows. When Augustus Montgomery finally emerged from the darkness, he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had built an empire on other people's suffering and was determined to protect it at any cost. He rode a magnificent black stallion, flanked by 6 armed men and followed by a 7th horse carrying a bound figure that could only be Marcus. "Mrs. Turner," Montgomery called out as he approached. "Or should I say, Mrs. Hayes, you've led me quite a chase." "It's over, Montgomery," Abigail replied, her voice carrying clearly across the silent camp. "Your men at Cedar Falls are surrounded. Your organization is being dismantled as we speak, and federal warrants have been issued for your arrest." Montgomery's laugh was cold and confident. "My dear woman, you seem to be laboring under several misconceptions. My men at Cedar Falls are proceeding exactly as planned, and as for federal warrants," he gestured dismissively, "money talks louder than justice in this territory." "Not this time," Abigail said firmly. "This time you've finally gone too far." "Have I?" Montgomery dismounted gracefully, signaling for his men to spread out around the clearing. "Let's see what I've actually done. I've eliminated a few troublesome families who refused reasonable offers for their land. I've removed a corrupt federal judge who was interfering with legitimate business activities, and I've defended myself against a gang of desperate fugitives who've been terrorizing the territory for months." The casual way he dismissed multiple murders as business expenses made Abigail's blood boil, but she forced herself to remain calm. Every word he spoke was being recorded by hidden witnesses building the case that would finally bring him to justice. "What about your son?" she asked, nodding toward Marcus. "Was betraying your own family also just business?" For the first time, Montgomery's confident facade cracked slightly. "Marcus made some poor choices influenced by people who didn't have his best interests at heart. But blood is blood. He'll learn from his mistakes. The way you learned from yours." Caleb spoke for the first time, stepping forward into the lamplight. "The way you learned from murdering my wife and daughters." Montgomery's eyes widened as he recognized the man he'd thought was dead. "Dr. Caleb Winters, I must admit I'm impressed. 8 years of hiding and you still managed to cause me considerable trouble." "Not as much trouble as I'm about to cause," Caleb replied grimly. "I think not," Montgomery said, drawing a pistol with practiced ease. "You see, Doctor, the beauty of wealth and power is that it allows a man to correct his mistakes. 8 years ago, I should have made sure you died in that fire with your family. Today, I remedy that oversight." The gun was aimed directly at Caleb's chest, and Abigail could see Montgomery's finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a new voice cut through the tension. "Father, stop!" Marcus Montgomery had somehow freed himself from his bonds and was struggling to dismount from his horse. "Enough killing. Enough lies. It has to end." "Marcus, be silent," Montgomery snapped, but his attention was divided, now his gun wavering between Caleb and his son. That moment of distraction was all Sheriff Duncan needed. His signal shot cracked across the camp like thunder, and suddenly the ruins came alive with armed lawmen converging from every direction. "Augustus Montgomery," Duncan's voice boomed across the clearing, "you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and treason against the United States." For a heartbeat, everything hung in perfect balance. Montgomery's men reached for their weapons, while federal marshals emerged from concealment with rifles ready. The pre-dawn air crackled with tension as two forces faced each other across the abandoned mining camp. Then, Augustus Montgomery made his choice. Instead of surrendering, instead of accepting the inevitable, he turned his gun toward the one person who could hurt him most, his own son. "If I can't have an empire," he snarled, "then at least I can make sure there's no one left to judge me for building it." The gunshot that followed would echo across the territory for years to come, but it wasn't Augustus Montgomery who fired it. As he turned toward Marcus, Abigail moved with desperate speed, tackling Montgomery from the side and sending his shot wild. They crashed to the ground together, rolling in the dirt as Montgomery's men opened fire on the surrounding lawmen. The camp erupted into chaos as bullets flew in every direction and men shouted orders through the gun smoke. But Abigail was focused entirely on the man beneath her, the monster who had destroyed her family and terrorized an entire territory. All her rage, all her grief, all her determination to see justice done crystallized into this single moment. "This is for David," she gasped, struggling to keep Montgomery's gun pointed away from anyone important. "This is for Sarah and Emma and Grace. This is for every family you've destroyed." Montgomery was stronger than she was, but Abigail had something he'd never possessed, the absolute certainty that some things were worth dying for. As they fought for control of the weapon, she saw her husband's face, heard Charlotte's laughter, remembered every moment of happiness that Montgomery had tried to steal from the world. The gun went off again, the bullet disappearing harmlessly into the sky. Around them, the battle was ending as quickly as it had begun. Duncan's men had been ready for resistance, and Montgomery's gunmen were vastly outnumbered. "Give up!" Abigail shouted over the chaos. "It's over, you've lost," but even defeat couldn't break Augustus Montgomery's arrogance. With a surge of desperate strength, he threw Abigail aside and scrambled to his feet, raising the gun toward Caleb one final time. "If I'm going to hang anyway," he began. The shot that cut off his words came from an unexpected source. Marcus Montgomery stood 10 feet away, smoke rising from the barrel of a rifle he'd picked up from one of the fallen gunmen. His face was pale, but determined as he watched his father crumple to the ground. "No more," Marcus said quietly. "No more killing, no more lies. It ends here." Augustus Montgomery lay motionless in the dirt, his reign of terror finally over. Around the camp, the last of his men were surrendering to federal marshals, their weapons thrown down in defeat. "Is he dead?" Abigail asked, struggling to her feet. Caleb knelt beside Montgomery, checking for a pulse. "No, but he's badly wounded. He'll live to stand trial." "Good," Abigail said with fierce satisfaction. "I want him to face a jury. I want the whole world to hear what he's done." As the sun finally rose over the Colorado mountains, casting golden light across the abandoned mining camp, Abigail felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd been carrying for months. The nightmare was over. Augustus Montgomery would face justice, his organization was destroyed, and the families of Cedar Falls would wake to safety instead of slaughter. But more than that, she had proven something to herself that she'd begun to doubt during the darkest moments of their flight, that ordinary people could stand against evil, and when that love and courage could triumph over greed and cruelty. She was no longer the hunted, she was no longer afraid. She was a survivor, a fighter, and a woman who had looked into the face of pure evil and refused to blink. The last keeper had found his purpose again, and Augustus Montgomery had learned too late that some victories come at a price too high to pay. The courtroom in Denver had never seen anything like it. For 3 weeks, the territory's most sensational trial had drawn crowds from across the West, all eager to witness the downfall of Augustus Montgomery. Newspaper reporters filled the front rows, their pencils scratching furiously as witness after witness took the stand to testify about the railroad baron's crimes. Abigail sat in the second row, Charlotte beside her in a new dress that Mrs. Patterson had insisted on buying. The child's health had returned completely, her cheeks rosy and her eyes bright with curiosity as she watched the proceedings she was still too young to fully understand. "Mama," Charlotte whispered during a brief recess, "why does that man look so angry all the time?" Abigail glanced toward the defendant's table, where Augustus Montgomery sat in shackles, his once immaculate appearance now reduced to a simple gray suit provided by the territorial prison. His face was indeed a mask of barely controlled rage, his blue eyes burning with the fury of a man who had never imagined he could be brought so low. "Because he's finally learning that actions have consequences, sweetheart. Abigail replied softly. Something he should have learned a long time ago. The prosecution's case had been devastating. Marcus Montgomery's testimony alone would have been enough to convict his father. But Sheriff Duncan and the federal prosecutors had been thorough. They'd presented evidence of at least 15 murders spanning 8 years, including the accidental deaths of the Turner and Winters families. The financial records that David Turner had so carefully documented proved systematic fraud on a scale that shocked even the most cynical observers. But it was the final witness of the trial who provided the most powerful testimonies. Dr. Caleb Winters took the stand on a brilliant autumn morning, his appearance transformed from the broken hermit who had hidden in the mountains. Clean-shaven and wearing a proper suit, he looked every inch the distinguished physician he had once been. Dr. Winters, the prosecutor began, please tell the court about the night of October 15, 1867. Caleb's voice was steady as he recounted the events that had destroyed his previous life. My wife Sarah was putting our daughters to bed when I received an emergency call to the hospital, difficult birth twin babies who needed immediate surgical intervention. I kissed my family goodbye and told them I'd be home by midnight. The courtroom was silent as he continued his words, painting a picture of domestic happiness shattered by deliberate evil. I was in surgery for 6 hours. When I finally finished and began the drive home, I could see the glow from 5 miles away. By the time I reached our street, there was nothing left but ashes and the fire department telling me that chimney problems were unfortunately common in houses built before the war. But you suspected otherwise, the prosecutor prompted. I knew otherwise, Caleb replied firmly. 3 families on our street had received threatening visits from Montgomery's representatives in the weeks before the fire. Generous offers to purchase land that wasn't for sale, followed by increasingly aggressive pressure when those offers were refused. After the fire, the remaining families suddenly found Montgomery's prices acceptable. Augustus Montgomery's lawyer had objected repeatedly, but the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showed that Montgomery had purchased the Turner and Winters properties at far below market value within weeks of the tragedies that had befallen their owners. Dr. Winters, the prosecutor continued, what did you do after losing your family? I died, Caleb said simply. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. I abandoned my practice, my friends, my responsibilities. I convinced myself that if I disappeared completely, if I became nobody, then maybe the pain would stop. And did it? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his eyes finding Abigail's face in the gallery. No, the pain never stops when you lose the people you love. But recently I've learned that sometimes you can transform that pain into something else, something useful. What do you mean? I mean that hiding from evil doesn't make it go away. Caleb replied, his voice growing stronger. I spent 8 years in those mountains telling myself that Augustus Montgomery's crimes weren't my responsibility. But when I saw him threatening another family, another child, he gestured toward Abigail and Charlotte, I realized that evil only triumphs when good people do nothing to stop it. The defense's cross-examination had been brutal, but ultimately ineffective. Montgomery's lawyer tried to paint Caleb as an unstable hermit seeking revenge against a successful businessman, but the mountain of evidence made such arguments seem desperate and hollow. Dr. Winters, the defense attorney had pressed, isn't it true that you've harbored feelings of revenge against my client for 8 years? No, Caleb replied calmly. Revenge would have been hunting down Augustus Montgomery and putting a bullet in his head. Justice is what we're doing here today, presenting evidence in a court of law and allowing a jury to decide his fate based on the facts. Now, as the trial entered its final phase, Abigail watched Augustus Montgomery confer with his lawyers and felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This was the man who had murdered her husband, who had destroyed Caleb's family, who had planned to orchestrate a war that would have killed thousands. But seeing him reduced to a common criminal in shackles, she found it hard to reconcile this pathetic figure with the monster who had haunted her nightmares. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecutor began his closing argument. This case is about more than the crimes of one man. It's about the kind of society we want to build in this territory. Do we want a place where wealth and influence place certain people above the law? Or do we want a community where justice applies equally to everyone regardless of their station? The defense's closing argument was predictably focused on reasonable doubt and the supposed unreliability of testimony from admitted criminals like Marcus Montgomery. But Abigail could see in the jurors' faces that they had already made up their minds. The evidence was simply too overwhelming to ignore. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Harrison asked when they returned to the courtroom. "We have your honor," the foreman replied, a stern-faced rancher whose own property had been threatened by Montgomery's agents years earlier. "On the charge of murder in the first degree and the death of federal judge David Turner, how do you find guilty?" "On the charge of murder in the first degree and the deaths of Sarah, Emma, and Grace Winters, how do you find guilty?" The litany of guilty verdicts continued for nearly 10 minutes, covering every charge the prosecution had brought. With each pronouncement, Augustus Montgomery seemed to shrink further into his chair, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his arrogant certainty that wealth could buy him out of any difficulty. "Augustus Montgomery," Judge Harrison said when the reading was complete, "you have been found guilty of multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, fraud, and treason against the United States. Before I pronounce sentence, do you have anything to say?" For a moment it seemed Montgomery might maintain his silence. Then he rose slowly, his shackles clanking as he faced the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice still carrying traces of the commanding presence that had once made him one of the most powerful men in the territory. "I am a businessman who saw opportunities and seized them. Everything I did was in the service of progress, of bringing civilization to this wilderness. If some people were hurt in that process, well, progress has always required sacrifice." The callousness of his statement sent a ripple of outrage through the courtroom. Even now, facing the gallows, Augustus Montgomery couldn't bring himself to acknowledge that his victims had been human beings with the same right to life and happiness that he claimed for himself. "Mr. Montgomery?" Judge Harrison replied, his voice cold with disgust. "You speak of progress and civilization, but what you brought to this territory was terror and death. You murdered children in their beds, you destroyed families for profit, and you planned to start a war that would have killed thousands more innocent people." The judge paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "The law provides only one appropriate punishment for crimes of this magnitude. Augustus Montgomery, I hereby sentence you to death by hanging to be carried out at sunrise on November 15th, 1875. The gavel's bang echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, and Abigail felt something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine peace. Justice had been served. The man who had murdered her husband would pay for his crimes, and the families he had destroyed would finally have closure. But even as she savored the moment of victory, Abigail knew that the real work was just beginning. Montgomery's criminal organization had been dismantled, but the conditions that had allowed it to flourish remained: corruption in territorial government, the vast power wielded by railroad companies, the casual brutality with which Native Americans and small farmers were treated. All of these problems would require ongoing vigilance to address. "Mrs. Turner," a familiar voice said beside her. She turned to see Thomas Benedict, the reporter who had helped expose Montgomery's crimes. "I wonder if I might have a word." They stepped outside the courthouse, where Benedict pulled out his notebook and pencil. "I'm writing a book about this case," he explained. "The full story of how Montgomery was brought to justice. I'd like to include your perspective if you're willing." "What kind of perspective?" Abigail asked cautiously. "The perspective of someone who fought back," Benedict replied. "Too often these stories focus on the criminals or the lawmen who caught them, but this case was different. This case was won by ordinary people who refused to be victims." Abigail considered his request carefully. The attention that had come with the trial had been difficult enough. She wasn't sure she wanted her story told to an even wider audience. "There's something you should understand, Mr. Benedict," she said finally. "I didn't set out to be a hero. I was just a woman trying to protect her child. Everything else, it just happened." "That's exactly why your story matters," Benedict replied earnestly. "People need to know that they don't have to accept injustice, that ordinary citizens can stand up to powerful criminals and win." Before Abigail could respond, Dr. Caleb Winters emerged from the courthouse, his face showing the strain of the past 3 weeks. He'd testified for 2 full days, reliving the worst moments of his life for the sake of justice. "How are you holding up?" Abigail asked as he approached. "Better than I expected," Caleb replied honestly. For 8 years, I thought talking about Sarah and the girls would destroy me. But it turns out that remembering them in the service of justice, it's healing in a way I didn't expect. What will you do now? Benedict asked. Will you return to your cabin in the mountains? Caleb was quiet for a moment, looking out over the bustling streets of Denver. I've been thinking about that, he said finally. The territorial government has offered me a position as chief medical officer for the region, ensuring that isolated communities have access to proper health care. That sounds wonderful, Abigail said, genuinely pleased. You could help so many people. There's just one problem. Caleb continued, his eyes meeting hers. The position would require a lot of travel visiting remote settlements and Indian reservations. It's not the kind of work a man should do alone. Abigail felt her heart skip a beat as she understood what he was suggesting. Caleb, I know it's sudden, he said quickly. I know we've both been through hell, and the last thing either of us needs is more complications. But when I think about the future, when I imagine what I want my life to look like. He paused, seeming to gather his courage. I can't imagine it without you and Charlotte. The proposal was so unexpected, so far from anything Abigail had allowed herself to consider, that for a moment she couldn't speak. But as she looked into Caleb's eyes, she saw something that had been missing from her life for months, hope for a future that held more than just survival. Caleb, she said softly, are you asking me to marry you? I'm asking you to consider it, he replied. I'm asking you to think about building something new together, something good that can come out of all this tragedy. Charlotte tugged at her mother's skirt, having grown bored with the adult conversation. Mama, can we go see the horses? Abigail looked down at her daughter, then back at Caleb, then out over the bustling city of Denver. 6 months ago, she'd been a judge's wife, living a comfortable, predictable life. Then tragedy had struck, and she'd spent months running and hiding, convinced that survival was the best she could hope for. But now, standing in the sunshine outside the courthouse where justice had finally been served, she realized that she had a choice to make. She could return to the safe, quiet life she'd known before, or she could take a chance on something new and uncertain, but full of possibility. Mr. Benedict, she said, turning to the reporter, if you're going to write this story, make sure you get this part right. What part? Benedict asked, pencil poised. The part where the widow and the hermit decided that surviving wasn't enough anymore, Abigail replied, taking Caleb's hand. The part where they decided to live. Caleb's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Is that a yes? That's a yes to considering it, Abigail said, squeezing his hand. But I have conditions. Name them. First, Charlotte and I come as a package deal. If you want me, you get both of us. I wouldn't have it any other way, Caleb replied immediately. Second, if I'm going to be a doctor's wife again, I want to be a useful one. I want to learn nursing, really learn it. I want to be able to help people, not just pour tea and make conversation. I'll teach you everything I know, Caleb promised. And the third? Abigail continued, her voice growing more serious. I never want to be helpless again. I want to learn to shoot, to ride, to defend myself and my family. I want to be a partner, not a burden. Mrs. Turner, Caleb said formally, I believe you may be the most formidable woman I've ever met. I'd be honored to have you as a partner. Charlotte had wandered over to examine a nearby horse and carriage, her attention caught by the beautiful animals. But she looked back at the sound of adult laughter, and Abigail was struck by how much her daughter had grown in the past few months. The frightened, sickly child who had fled through the storm was gone, replaced by a bright, resilient little girl who had learned that even when terrible things happened, there could still be happy endings. Charlotte, Abigail called. Come here, sweetheart. Dr. Winters has something to ask you. The child bounded back to them, her face bright with curiosity. What is it? Caleb knelt down to Charlotte's level, his expression serious but kind. Charlotte, how would you feel about having a new papa? Someone who would love you and take care of you and your mama. Charlotte considered this question with the gravity that children bring to truly important matters. Would he be mean to Mama? Never, Caleb promised solemnly. Would he make me eat vegetables I don't like? Only the ones that are good for you, Caleb replied with a smile. Would he teach me to ride a horse? Absolutely, Charlotte nodded decisively. Then yes, I think that would be nice. And just like that, the decision was made. Three people who had lost everything to the same evil man had found each other and chosen to build something new together. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was, but it would be theirs. "Well," Benedict said, scribbling frantically in his notebook, "this is definitely going in the book." 2 weeks later, as autumn painted the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and crimson, a small wedding took place in the Denver Presbyterian Church. Sheriff Duncan gave Abigail away. Mrs. Patterson served as matron of honor, and Charlotte scattered flower petals with the solemn concentration of someone performing a very important job. Marcus Montgomery attended the ceremony, his face bearing the permanent sadness of a man who had done the right thing at an enormous personal cost. He'd testified against his own father, helped bring down a criminal empire, and saved countless lives in the process. But he'd also lost his family and his inheritance, and the weight of those sacrifices was visible in every line of his face. "Thank you," Abigail said to him after the ceremony, "for having the courage to do what was right." "Thank you," Marcus replied quietly, "for showing me that it was possible to fight back and win." He left Denver the next day, bound for California and a new life under a new name. Some burdens, Abigail reflected, were too heavy for any one person to bear alone, but sometimes having the chance to do the right thing was enough to make those burdens bearable. The honeymoon was brief, just 3 days at a mountain lodge outside Denver, but it was enough time for Caleb and Abigail to begin the delicate process of learning to be a family. Charlotte took to her new stepfather with enthusiasm, particularly when he made good on his promise to teach her to ride. "She's fearless," Caleb observed as they watched Charlotte canter around the lodge's corral on a gentle mare. "She gets that from her father," Abigail replied. "David always said that fear was just another kind of prison." "Smart man," Caleb said, putting his arm around his new wife. "I wish I could have known him." "You would have liked each other," Abigail said with certainty. "You both believe that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost." On their last evening at the lodge, as they sat on the porch, watching Charlotte play with Phantom in the meadow below, Caleb brought up the subject they'd been avoiding. "The territorial medical officer position," he said carefully. "Are you sure you want to take this on? It won't be easy. Remote locations, dangerous travel people who might not welcome outsiders." Abigail was quiet for a moment, thinking about the comfortable life she could have if they chose differently. They could settle in Denver or return east, where Caleb's medical reputation would ensure a prosperous practice. They could live safely, quietly, without risk or hardship. "Do you remember what you told me that first night?" she asked finally. "When I asked why you helped us." "Sometimes a man gets a chance to do the right thing," Caleb recited. "When it does, you don't waste it." "Exactly," Abigail said. "We have skills, knowledge, resources that could help people who have nowhere else to turn. If we don't use those gifts to make the world a little better, then what's the point of having them?" "It could be dangerous," Caleb warned. "Some of the places we'd go, some of the people we'd be helping. There are still men like Montgomery out there, still people who profit from others' suffering." "Then we'll deal with them the same way we dealt with Montgomery," Abigail replied firmly. "Together." 3 months later, Dr. and Mrs. Caleb Winters made their first official visit to a Cheyenne reservation in eastern Colorado. The conditions they found there were appalling: inadequate food, no medical care, children dying of diseases that could have been easily treated with proper supplies. "How long since you've seen a doctor?" Abigail asked the tribal elder who had agreed to meet with them. 3 years, the old man replied through a translator. "Government sends promises but no medicine." Caleb and Abigail exchanged a look that spoke volumes. This was exactly the kind of injustice they'd committed to fighting, the kind of neglect that allowed suffering to flourish in the shadows. "We'll be back next month," Caleb promised, "with supplies, with medicine, with whatever you need." "Why?" the elder asked, suspicion clear in his voice. "What do you want in return?" "Nothing," Abigail replied simply. "We want nothing except the chance to help." It took 6 months of regular visits before the tribe began to trust them completely, but once that trust was established, the results were remarkable. Child mortality dropped dramatically. Disease outbreaks that had once devastated the community were contained before they could spread. And for the first time in years, the reservation hospital had adequate supplies and trained staff. "You know," Caleb said one evening as they made camp between the reservation and their next stop, "I think I'm starting to understand something." "What's that?" Abigail asked, stirring the stew she was cooking over their campfire. For 8 years, I thought my life was over because I'd lost my family. But maybe my real life was just waiting to begin. Charlotte looked up from the book she was reading by firelight. At 7 years old, she could already read better than many adults, and her appetite for learning seemed insatiable. "Papa Caleb," she said, using the name she'd chosen for her stepfather, "are we going to help more people tomorrow?" "We are indeed, little scholar," Caleb replied, ruffling her hair affectionately. "Good," Charlotte said with satisfaction. "I like helping people. It makes me feel like Papa David is still with us, watching us do good things." Abigail felt tears prick her eyes at her daughter's words. David would indeed be proud of what they were building, she thought. A new kind of family dedicated not to wealth or comfort, but to service and justice. 2 years after Augustus Montgomery's execution, the Winters family had become a legend throughout the Colorado Territory. The doctor who had returned from the dead, the widow who had fought back against impossible odds, and the little girl who could recite poetry in 3 languages while helping her parents deliver babies in remote mountain cabins. Their reputation brought them to the attention of government officials in Washington, who offered Caleb a position as Surgeon General for the entire Western Territories. It was a prestigious appointment that would have made them wealthy and influential. They turned it down. Why? The official who had made the offer asked during his visit to Denver. "You could do so much more good from a position of real authority." "We're already doing good," Abigail replied simply. "Right here with our own hands in places where authority never reaches. But think of the policies you could influence, the reforms you could implement." "Policies and reforms are important," Caleb agreed, "but they don't replace a mother's fear when her child has a fever and there's no doctor within 100 miles. They don't ease an old man's pain when he's dying alone because civilization forgot he existed." The official left empty-handed but impressed. In his report to Washington, he wrote that the Winters family represented the best of American values: self-reliance, compassion, and an unshakable commitment to justice. What he didn't mention, because he didn't know to look for it, was the small grave marker in the Denver cemetery that Abigail visited every month. David Turner's grave was simple and unadorned, except for the words she'd chosen for his headstone. He fought for justice and taught others to do the same. On a warm spring morning, 5 years after Montgomery's execution, Abigail knelt beside that grave with a bouquet of wildflowers and some news she thought David would want to hear. "We got word yesterday that the railroad reform bill passed Congress," she said softly, arranging the flowers with care. "The one based on your evidence and Marcus Montgomery's testimony. No more forced sales, no more mysterious fires, no more families destroyed for the sake of progress." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, and for a moment Abigail could almost imagine it was David's voice answering her. "Charlotte's getting married next month," she continued, "to a young lawyer who reminds me a lot of you, actually. Idealistic, stubborn, absolutely convinced he can change the world one case at a time." She smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I think you'd like him." She was quiet for a while after that, just sitting in the peaceful cemetery and remembering the man who had started it all. David Turner had died believing that truth and justice would ultimately triumph over greed and corruption. He'd been right, but the victory had come at a price he'd never imagined. "Mrs. Winters." A young voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see a boy of perhaps 12 years old, his clothes marking him as one of the street children who made their living running errands for busy adults. "Yes," she replied kindly. "There's a lady at your house says she needs to see you urgent-like," the boy said, slightly out of breath from running. "Says it's about some folks in trouble up north." Abigail sighed, recognizing the familiar pattern. There was always someone in trouble, always another injustice that needed addressing. But that was the life she'd chosen, the purpose that gave meaning to her days. "Tell the lady I'll be there in 10 minutes, she said, giving the boy a coin for his trouble. She stood up, brushing dirt from her skirts and taking one last look at David's grave. "I have to go," she said softly. "Someone needs help. And you taught me never to ignore that call." As she walked back toward town, Abigail reflected on how much her life had changed since that terrible night when everything had begun. She'd been beaten down, hunted and broken, but she'd never been defeated. And now, surrounded by a family built on love rather than obligation, and dedicated to service rather than comfort, She finally understood what David had been trying to tell her all those years ago. Justice wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you created one choice at a time, one stand at a time, one act of courage at a time. And as long as there were people willing to fight for what was right, evil would never have the final word. The last keeper had found his purpose, and the woman who'd been beaten 100 times had discovered that sometimes the gentlest touch could heal the deepest wounds. Together they'd built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy, proving that even in the darkest night, dawn was always possible for those brave enough to believe in it. Behind her, the wind continued to whisper through the cemetery trees, carrying with it the promise that some loves transcend death and some battles are worth fighting, no matter the cost. The story of Augustus Montgomery was over. But the story of justice, real justice fought for and won by ordinary people who refused to accept defeat, would continue as long as there were hearts brave enough to believe in tomorrow.